Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and moderator. Please note that full bios are available out on your tables. First, we are delighted to have Steve Edwards with us today, moderating the conversation. Steve is the Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Nonpartisan Institute of Politics. Previously, Steve worked as a journalist covering politics and policy for BBC, Bloomberg News, PBS, and numerous public radio stations. Most recently, he spent 14 years at WBEZ, where he served as host of the daily shows The Afternoon Shift and 848. He has moderated numerous candidate debates, hosted the weekly political show The Best Game in Town, and was the correspondent for a BBC documentary on Chicago's political culture. Steve is also a member of the Economic Club. Welcome, Steve. Our featured speaker today is David Axelrod, a veteran of American politics and journalism and former chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. He currently serves as director of the Institute of Politics. He is also a political commentator for CNN and host of the X-Files, a top-rated podcast jointly produced by CNN and his institute. David, a former political writer for the Chicago Tribune and later media strategist for 150 state, local, and national political campaigns, is also the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. Please join me in welcoming Steve Edwards and David Axelrod.
Keith, thank you so much for that introduction, and to the club for the opportunity to be here in conversation with my boss, David Axelrod. I should say, this is actually the first time we've had a chance since the election to actually sit down and have this conversation.
Yes, we might as well do it in front of a bunch of,
exactly.
bunch of friends. I might choose some different words, I don't know. When we got this invitation, I had no idea how exciting this would be.
Yeah, tell me about it. I mean, that's the thing, right? So many of us who've been following politics, so many of the people that we talk to who come through the Institute and have been commenting on this election just got this wrong. So as you look back...
Yeah, me.
Yeah, my son actually said, after I kind of reminded him of all of the errant predictions I made, he said, "How do you still have a job?"
Yes, assure him you're not alone.
So tell us what happened. What drove the outcome on Tuesday last week?
Well, I think, as is often the case, hindsight is 20/20. And when you look at the numbers, what is clear is, parts of the Democratic base weren't as galvanized as they had been in the last two elections, particularly in the African-American community. In some cities, in Philadelphia, for example, the turnout was very robust. In Detroit and Milwaukee, it was way off. Yeah. And I think more study needs to be done as to why that was. But what is true in the main is that in rural communities and small towns across the industrial Midwest in particular, Hillary Clinton underperformed Barack Obama significantly, probably by 9 or 10 points. I'll give you an example. Macomb County, which is kind of iconic as the sort of Reagan Democrat county in Michigan outside of Detroit, Barack Obama carried it by 4 points 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton lost it by 12. And as you look through the industrial Midwest, you find examples like that in each of these states. And when you're talking small margins, I mean, she'll have lost and Trump will have won Michigan, Wisconsin by really slim margins. These things were determinative. So why did it happen is the question. And I think part of it is when you think about the messaging of the Democratic campaign and the messaging of the Republican campaign, of the Trump campaign, it's pretty clear. The Democratic message was about diversity. It was about the new emerging coalition. It was about African Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans and young people and suburbanites, college-educated voters, particularly women. And I think the message that was sent to working-class white voters in these places where she didn't do as well was, you're not part of this. And at the same time, you had Donald Trump, who was focused like a laser on those very same voters, telling them that you're held in disdain, you've been, you're the product of a rigged system, which leads to the economic piece of this. The fact is, and we're here at the Economics Club, so it's an appropriate place to have this discussion. We live in revolutionary times, wrought by technology, and we see it in our economy, we see it in communications. But in the economy, the ability to automate jobs that used to be done by people and that were good middle-class jobs, I think is far more important than globalization, which has become the target. The fact is that we have machines that are doing jobs that people used to do. It takes 1/10 of the number of people to run an auto plant today, for example, as it did 30 years ago. I had an interesting conversation on the podcast with Fareed Zakaria, who raised the fact that by the end of this decade, driverless cars are going to be online and available and in use, in wide use. We've got 3 million people in this country who drive for a living, drive cabs, drive trucks, drive buses. Where are they going in this economy? And this stuff is churning so quickly, we don't give it, we don't have a strategy, a national strategy for dealing with this, and we're not alone in this. You see this in Europe, in all the advanced economies are feeling the same convulsions, and then you have the overlay of rapid cultural change, demographic change, and it's a combustible stew. So by sending that message, I think that the Clinton campaign, the Democratic campaign, actually abetted the Make America Great Again campaign of Donald Trump, which said, we're going to go back to the way it was. Yeah. Now, we can't go back to the way it was, and that is going to be his problem because he promised to bring back the auto plants and the steel plants and the coal mines. They're not coming back, but he doesn't really have an answer to replace it. And the challenge for the Democratic Party is to speak to that and provide real actionable answers.
There's so much more to talk about on the election itself, and we'll take your questions in just a bit and we can get back to it. But let me stay with sort of the moment at hand now. So he, as president-elect, is working on his transition team, trying to determine who will be in what roles, but also the policies he's going to emphasize. We're hearing a bit about that now. What are the prospects that he will be able to get the kinds of things he wants done around taxes, around infrastructure, immigration, or a whole series of things with the Congress that he has?
I think the prospects are better for some than for others. I think you can expect that there'll be a big tax cut coming because I think the Republican Congress is eager to vote for one. I think you can be sure that there's going to be some significant deregulation because the Republican Congress is eager for that. I think they all have to do something on health care because the Obamacare mantra has been so much part of the Republican campaigns. I think what they do is a big question, however, because what they'll discover is, Donald Trump says, well, I want to keep that piece that protects people with pre-existing conditions. I want to keep that piece that keeps kids under 26 on their parents' insurance. And there are others that are really popular. And we don't want to hurt the 20 million people who've gotten insurance under that program. What he's going to find is the healthcare system is monstrously complicated. And if you remove one brick, the whole wall can fall down. So I think they will do something symbolically to the Affordable Care Act. But I think the wholesale repeal would be so calamitous that I think they're going to move more slowly. On immigration, I think that there are Republicans in the leadership in Congress who are deeply concerned about being too aggressive on that issue. But I think when you look at the people who are in charge of that issue for him, Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State from Kansas, who is sort of the national leader on the right on immigration, and Jeff Sessions, who is deeply involved in his transition, has now, yesterday he was going to be Defense Secretary, by the end of the day he was going to be Attorney General. So I don't know. But Sessions as Attorney General would send a lot of shockwaves because he has been the leading proponent of very draconian immigration policies. So that suggests to me that the president-elect is going to move on immigration more aggressively than I would hope, and that I think a lot of Americans fear.
So take us inside the transition process. You just mentioned the Sessions trial balloons in different directions. We're hearing that from a lot of circles. As somebody who went through a transition process, what's the reality like as you move from candidate and campaign?
Well, the key word is process, because you have to have one. And it's not clear to me that Donald Trump, no, I mean, I don't mean that facetiously. It's not clear to me that until 8:30 on Tuesday, November 8th, that he believed he was going to be president. You read that he didn't want to talk about the transition because he thought it was bad luck, which is maybe our bad luck.
Although he did have a team, as did Hillary Clinton.
Which just got dismissed.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris Christie was the transition coordinator, and he just got summarily dumped, as did most of the people. I was...
Mike Rogers is out.
Mike Rogers, a former congressman from Michigan who was head of the Homeland Security Committee in the House, is someone I've come to know because he works at CNN and we do some stuff together. It gave me some confidence that he was there. He just got dismissed yesterday, and that was concerning to me. I think the biggest concern I have, I was talking to Lester Crown about this a second ago, the biggest concern I have is in the area of national security, because, you know, the whole, Trump's rhetoric during the campaign was very hostile to international institutions and kind of brazenly disregarding of them. NATO, for example. His flirtation with Putin is one of great concern, and it's certainly of great concern. I was in Ukraine a month or so ago, and you know, all of Eastern Europe is concerned about what his relationship with Putin means, what his rhetoric about not honoring the NATO Article 5 of NATO means, and you know, the thing that most concerns me is I sat next to a president for 2 years. I know what the job entails, and I also know that the words that you speak as president can, one misspoken word or tweeted can send armies marching and markets tumbling. And I worry about the inexperience of this new president in these realms and his penchant for being impulsive in a world in which impulsivity can be disastrous.
Yeah. Well, that, I think, accurately reflects concerns that a lot of the people who did not vote for Trump felt. But we also have many people who see a decisive leader, they see somebody who's been experienced in business, and see the opportunity to forge a new kind of relationship in Washington. And indeed, many Republicans who weren't supportive of Trump on the Hill now see maybe there's an opening for us to push our agenda through.
Yeah, well, I mean,
how do you read that?
I think that I don't think that Trump has a well-formulated sort of worldview on a lot of these issues. And so in that sense, he's an empty vessel, and people are rushing in to try and fill that vessel. Some are the sort of traditional conservative Republicans in Washington. And then you have this more populist sort of alt-right group. And so it remains to be seen, and I think the first clues will be who will fill some of these key positions. I was somewhat relieved when Reince Priebus was appointed the chief of staff. I know him. You know, obviously we have different views, but that's the nature of democracy, that they won, you know. But he also has, I think, a respect for institutions that is very important. And, but then on the other hand, Steve Bannon is taking my old job in the White House, the guy from Breitbart, and that is a concern. So it's very unclear and unsettled, and I think that not just across America, but across the world, people are watching. But let me comment on one thing that you said, which is a lot of people voted for him. I think what's stunning to me about this election, and what speaks to something larger about our country right now, is that a lot of people who voted for Trump did not believe that he could lose, because no one around them was voting for Hillary Clinton. A lot of people, and perhaps people in this room, couldn't believe that Trump could win because no one they knew was voting for Trump. And it speaks to how divided we are and this, you know, this spoke to class divisions in our society, and it spoke to, I mean, part of the impact of our new economy is that we have this sorting of people aggregating in metropolitan areas who tend to vote Democratic, who tend to do better, and then we have people in rural areas who tend to vote Republican. And the lack of conversation back and forth, the lack of understanding, is a real concern for the country. Yeah. And you know, you'd like to think that Donald Trump could be, you know, that a president could provoke some dialogue around this. You know, I don't know if he has the wherewithal to do that.
I mean, everything you just talked about, you know, you see it at the macro level in the red state, blue state divide over the last several cycles, but you see it especially in the county by county vote. When you start to color that, you really see how Democratic support is concentrated in urban areas along the coast, and you have this vast middle here. But it's also reflected, as you and I have talked about too, in the media choices that we make, right? And what we choose to read and follow. And you know, I think in the postmortems that have happened over the last few days, there has been a lot of critique of the media about them missing the bigger trends, about the way in which...
Because the media lives in that one world, and those voters who elected Trump live in another. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's not...
The idea of getting out and talking to voters.
We've become too reliant on public polls, many of which are flawed, almost all of which were wrong in this election. And news budgets have shrunk. So, you know, it used to be that when I started as a political reporter, like my role models were people like David Broder, Jack Germond, some of these old-time reporters who got in a car and drove around states and knocked on doors. In fact, David Marinus was on my podcast, who was another great political reporter who was a protege of Broder's, and he said, I can't remember which election, but the election was over. It was like February in the following year, and they're sitting in the lunchroom at the Washington Post, and Broder said, I just feel like going up to Manchester and knocking on doors, don't you? But you know, there isn't that impulse anymore to go out and actually ask people what they're thinking and what's motivating them. And you know, there is a cultural disdain here, and I think a lot of reporters, and I think, you know, I include myself in the blame, but just you know, just said, I cannot believe that Donald Trump could be president of the United States, and did not, and took the polls at their word and did not suspend that disbelief, and now we are where we are.
And it wasn't just those things, though. It was that he ran a campaign that from the very beginning defied every piece of conventional wisdom that we've come to know about how you run a successful presidential campaign. Paid media strategy, field operation, calling into shows live on television, campaign finance, all of these things were considered gospel on both sides within political consulting circles. In fact, Mark Leibovich of the Times Magazine says, Mr. Trump's complete command of the Coliseum as the primaries in 2016 will go down as a line of demarcation campaign in which every presidential election that came before it will seem quaint, tame, and antiquated by comparison. And he goes on to talk about all the ways in which this is not just a new era rhetorically, but it's a new era strategically. What do you make of that?
Well, I make, first of all, that the first thing that one should learn from this election is do not offer universal lessons that are going to carry forward from this election. I think humility is the order of the day. But I will say this. I always believed that television advertising was almost worthless after Labor Day in a presidential race. In 2012, we moved a lot of money from the fall to the spring to help define the race. And the reason is because coverage is so intense after Labor Day that people don't pay attention to ads. They're watching the candidates. And Donald Trump advanced that schedule by a year and a half. He became so ubiquitous that television ads didn't matter, because if you wanted to hear from or about Donald Trump or hear him respond to stuff, you could turn on television at any time of day or night and you'll probably find him, you know, whether it's on CNN or on Fox or MSNBC or the Home Garden Network and on Twitter. Yeah. But you know, one of the things that worries me is he did break all the rules and he won. And I think the wrong lesson that he may take away from this is that he can break all the rules, and he should break all the rules, and he's going to continue breaking all the rules because that's how we need to reinforce some of our institutions here, and he is now an institutional figure. And so this morning he was off tweeting again, you know, about the failing New York Times, and you know, if he takes every bait and responds the way he does, we get back into that problem that I mentioned before, which is you know, the army's marching and the market's tumbling. I do think that what is likely to happen is I do not see Donald Trump sitting in the White House 12 hours a day mulling over, you know, weighty issues. I don't see that happening. I do think that he will be on the road a lot and campaigning for his priorities, because that's what he enjoys doing. He enjoys those rallies. He enjoys the bright lights. So.
And how do you feel about that? I mean, one of the critiques of the Obama presidency, particularly early on, was that there wasn't enough of that at times.
Actually, I think we had the president out too much. We just had him out on the wrong things. We turned him into sort of a announcer of the government instead of a narrator of a larger story, which was corrected over time. Look, I don't begrudge him that, going out and making the case. I just worry about who's back home making the decisions. Yeah. I mean, you know, one thing about Barack Obama, and, you know, obviously I revere the guy, and I think my association with him is, without a doubt, the greatest good fortune of my professional life. But he went home every night, and there are friends of his here who can attest to this. He went home every night. He left that office always to get home for dinner at 6:30 with his family, with a thick folder of homework to do. And he always did it. I was never in a meeting when he wasn't fully prepared, up on the issues, and there with questions that, frankly, no one else had thought of. Now, not every president's going to operate that way, but you have to do the basics. And I just don't know. I mean, you know, I hope for the sake of the country that he can grow in this role. But there is an ADD quality to this guy that is a little bit disquieting.
I want to open up the floor to questions through the mechanism that Keith was talking about. You can text Axelrod and leave a space and then your question to 1-747-444-3548, and to get to as many of your questions as possible. But
I was just touting technology, so let's see how adroit you are.
And we'll work those questions in. But let me ask you, just to put on a hat, let's assume you're inside the transition meetings right now. What advice would you be giving to Donald Trump about how to make this move into the presidency effectively? Like, what are the 3 things he should be doing?
Yeah,
or stop doing?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, what I think he should be doing may not be what he thinks he should be doing. So let's be clear about that. I would, you know, I would have liked to have seen, like, Bob Corker as Secretary of State, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because he's experienced, he's responsible, but he wasn't a big supporter of Trump, so he was, by his own account, sort of eliminated from consideration. I would think very carefully about, you know, this notion of Rudy Giuliani as Secretary of State. I think the conflicts are huge. You know, I would be thoughtful about who I put in these positions, and the hardest thing in government, and maybe the hardest thing in any pursuit, is not to think about what you want to do next, but what comes after that. What are the ramifications of these decisions? If I make this appointment, what message does it send? What kind of fight am I going to have to wage to get this appointment? You know, I would kind of order my priorities and make my appointments with a mind toward reassuring people that he can govern. That doesn't mean he should abandon some of the promises he made, but I think that if he wants to go from a guy who didn't get a majority of the votes and who barely slipped in because of the Electoral College, and let me say parenthetically, Founding Fathers developed the Electoral College idea in order to keep the larger mercantile states from overwhelming the, you know, the agrarian slaveholder states, yeah. And you know, it still is serving that purpose, but you know, he did not get a mandate, and it'd be a mistake to think of it that way. And I think a little humility would be both surprising and very welcome.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions here that I want to weave in. One on the Democratic Party and its future. But let me just stay with your reference to the Electoral College. One of the questions here is, has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness?
It's funny because like days before the election, Donald Trump said yes. Yeah. 2 days after the election, he tweeted that it was genius, which shows that he can be flexible. And now a lot of folks on the Democratic side of the equation are bemoaning the Electoral College when for months they were saying, well, he can't win because of the blue wall and this and that. The fact is, it's almost an academic discussion because it's not going to change. The process of changing that is such that I just don't see there ever being enough support in the country, given the way you have to amend the Constitution, that it will get changed.
Talked a little bit about advice for Trump. Now, if you're meeting with congressional Democratic leadership on the Hill, how do you think they'll respond? How should they respond to a Trump presidency?
Well, I think that they certainly are reading the same numbers that I'm reading, and I think that the biggest parlor game in politics is, well, what if Joe Biden had been the candidate? What if Bernie Sanders had been the candidate? But I think that the lesson that they apparently have taken is that if the Democratic Party had a more populist economic message, that the Democratic Party would have prevailed. That today Bernie Sanders was added to the leadership team in the Senate. There's Senator Schumer has endorsed Keith Ellison, who was a Sanders supporter, for party chair. DNC. I think it's a terrible mistake. Keith Ellison's a lovely guy, but I don't think any member of Congress should be chairman of the Democratic National Committee. I don't think it worked out well with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but now it's particularly important because it is a full-time job. Rebuilding the party is a full-time job. And I think my advice organizationally would be that, plus pay attention to all 50 states, take seriously not just elections for president and senator, but for all statewide offices and state legislative offices, because who controls these legislatures is important, particularly as you're heading into reapportionment. And the one thing I will say for Democrats who are looking for some solace in these results is that whereas I think that we would have seen a devastating midterm election in 2018 for Democrats, I think it's now going to be a harder election for Republicans. They have structural advantages in the Senate, but in other races, I think things are probably going to be more competitive for Democrats.
Yeah, we have a few questions here about media, and one reads just simply, what does it mean that truth did not matter in this election? To broaden that a bit, we had, frankly, claims from both campaigns and both candidates that were tested and proved to be false. We had, in the case of the fact checkers and voters, a lot of cognitive dissonance in certain ways. So
yeah, I think the only people more depressed than the pundits are the fact checkers, who took a terrible beating in this election. I mean, this is a concern, this is another manifestation of technology and social media. And, you saw one of the issues in Facebook and Google are now trying to address this, but, fake news.
Yeah.
Fake news, some 17-year-old kid in Macedonia was sending out fake news stories, mostly maligning Hillary Clinton, but getting a lot of advertising. And these things, really outrageous lies are circulating 2 and 3 million times, and so we've got, and so we live in a time when people now, we all used to watch the same news basically and read, responsible news outlets to inform us, and now we live in an era where people choose media outlets to affirm their point of view. Yeah. And that drives us further apart and makes it harder to bridge these chasms. So I don't know what we do about that, but I think we need to have there's got to be some soul searching on the part of the media And we as a society have to have some soul searching about what this means for cohesion.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder to some degree if one is the manifestation of the other. You talked about the deeper divides, class, outlook, values, and our media sort of reinforces those things and reflects those things, and they both have kind of a reciprocal engine that drives the other, right? It's not just so much that media is driving the one, but there's now a climate where that's an attractive way to consume information.
I
right?
mean,
That
look,
reaffirms.
one of the issues that concerns me most as I look at this administration incoming is the issue of climate change, where you have 99% of the scientific community on one side, and yet you've got large numbers of people, not a majority, who are doubtful. I think that number has been shrinking. But the guy who Donald Trump has appointed to be his transition officer to the EPA is the world's leading climate denier. Yeah. And the oil and gas industry is running the transition. So on energy issues. So that's a real problem. If all the scientists are sort of giving us a high alert, and it's being dismissed. So it's concerning.
You mentioned climate. We talked a little bit about immigration in passing, a little bit about healthcare. I mean, whether through legislative accomplishment or executive orders, these were big achievements of the Obama administration. How concerned are you that the things that you and others have worked for the last 8+ years are going to be eroded, that the legacy is vanishing?
Thanks for that question, Steve. I guess I take a long-term view of these things. It hardens me. I'm devastated about the healthcare law because I so often run into people who have been beneficiaries of it, whose lives were saved or changed because of it, and I worry about them. On the other hand, when you hear Donald Trump or others address it, now the goalpost has shifted. Now it's not acceptable to exclude people with pre-existing conditions. It's not acceptable that that these 20 million people and presumably others aren't insured. We're going to take a couple of steps back, but we've taken a big step forward because of the courage that the president showed in pursuing this issue. On climate change, he, single-handedly through negotiations with the auto industry, really raised fuel efficiency standards in a big way. Obviously, some of the stuff he's done through the EPA is now going to be tested. Yeah. And maybe reversed. The biggest concern I have there is the Paris Agreement. It was Barack Obama who brought the world together and brought the Chinese in. Now it's so ironic. The Chinese and the Indians are warning the U.S. not to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. They were the reluctant parties, and they're obviously big sources of greenhouse gases as we are. I worry about that agreement unraveling because if we're not in, the impetus for others to be in will be reduced. But again, he moved the ball forward. We're going to take some steps back, but we're not going to go back to where we were before he was president.
There's another question about women's issues in the Supreme Court. As you look at a Trump presidency, what's a constructive path forward?
Well, I think this is obviously a big concern. You saw him on 60 Minutes the other night reaffirm that he's going to appoint pro-life judges, and he said, we'll send it back to the states. And when he was asked about the fact that what about the women who live in a state where abortion services are banned, he said, well, they may have to go to another state. That wasn't reassuring. And so I think this is going to be a big fight. I will say this. The Democratic Party failed to speak to those voters I mentioned before. And they failed it isn't just about jobs and wages. It's about dignity. It's about self-respect. We should never forget that jobs are not just about paychecks. jobs are about a sense of self-worth and identity. We didn't speak to that, but it is true that this country is changing and changing rapidly, and we are becoming more diverse. And I think women are not eager to go back. So I think that the Republican Party pursues this path of Trump's at their own peril.
Yeah. Another question here has to do with Hillary Clinton and gender and whether being a woman contributed to her loss on this. And there are other questions about how much of this was about Trump, how much of this was about Comey and the FBI. So in terms of her gender and her performance broadly, how do you assess the role that those things play?
Well, you know, I think that there's obviously, you know, it's very hard to sort of disentangle that. I assume that there was an element of that. But I will point out that she lost dramatically among non-college educated women. And that had, you know, so that has to be
And the margin among college educated women
was not
very
great.
tight.
Was not great. Yeah. So maybe some men voted against her. Undoubtedly, some did because she was a woman. But what was striking to me was that this notion that women would be galvanized on her behalf, that didn't happen. So that was interesting. On Comey, I have no doubt that what he did was impactful on the election. I think he thought he was protecting his institution by doing what he did. Instead, he plunged it into politics in a way that was clearly detrimental to Hillary Clinton. And I think he did damage to his institution as a result of it. But I will say this, if we're going to be completely honest about it, if there's no email server, there's no Comey. If there's no Bill Clinton getting on the plane ill-advisedly with the Attorney General, there's no Comey. So Comey was not sort of an abstract thing that sort of descended on the campaign. Comey was the result of a series of misjudgments that shouldn't have been made.
Yeah. One of the other questions here from those who are with us had to do with whether Bernie Sanders would have been a better nominee and would have
Well,
won
I always thought
Trump.
it was kind of far-fetched that a 74 or 5-year-old Jewish socialist from Vermont could get elected president. But then Donald Trump won. So, but I don't know. You know, one thing about having been through these presidential races is I do have an appreciation for just how hard they are. And they are long auditions, and the opportunity to slip, to make mistakes are numerous. It is what it should be. I mean, it didn't quite function the way you'd think it should this time, but how people look at how you handle pressure and how I don't know, because Bernie never got to that point, how he would have handled that. I don't know how the vice president would have handled it.
Well, and you and I have talked before. You have said during the primary campaign that strategically and otherwise on the part of the Clinton campaign, they didn't really go after him. So he didn't face the full heat of, you know, a critical negative attack the way other candidates would, or had he stayed in longer.
No, but
he
never ever sustained any. You know, the Clinton people were thinking that they were going to win. They were very reluctant to attack him. The Republicans were eager for him to give her as hard a race as he could, so they weren't going to attack him. So he really lived a charmed life in that campaign. That's not the way the real world works.
Yeah. Let's move to the meeting that happened last week between President Obama and President-elect Trump. Question here from the floor is, what was your impression of that meeting and that dynamic?
It reminded me of My Fair Lady, with the president as Professor Henry Higgins and Donald Trump as Eliza Doolittle. You know, and I say this not with any. I have not talked to the president about the meeting, but just from the outward appearance, it really sounded like the president gave him a tutorial on the presidency. I honestly have sympathy for him, because no one who enters the presidency is fully prepared for what they're going to find. But the awesome responsibilities that this job entails and the complexity of it would cower anyone. to some degree. And so I think what you saw with Mr. Trump slumped in the chair next to the president was a guy who just came face to face with he was the dog who just came face to face with the car he caught.
Take us back, if you can, to November of 2008. You and the president-elect's top advisors and campaign advisors are all huddled in a conference room here in downtown Chicago.
It was in December, actually, but yes.
What happened?
Well, all the economic advisors the new economic advisors were there, and one by one they gave us a report. Remember, at that time, there wasn't broad recognition of just how deep the crisis was. But they reported on it, maybe a second Great Depression, banks are locked up and could collapse, trillions more in debt. And Obama said, well, it's too late to ask for a recount, I guess, so we better do something about it. But it was sobering, and I will always remember his bearing when he got that briefing, because everybody looks to the leader, and he sent a signal that we're going to get through this, and that gave everybody strength to move forward. It's an important role of the president, and I think he's been doing that within the White House in the last week.
Yeah. Also from the floor, some are interested in the Trump family and the children, both the role that they may play informally or not, and questions of security clearance, nepotism, all of that.
He said this morning that he wasn't asking for it. I just assumed that this was the holiday.
That Jared Kushner wasn't asking
that this was the holiday gift for the kids who have everything. Right?
A little security clearance under the tree.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Little stocking stuffer.
Exactly. But I mean, it's obviously a really bad idea, because they're running his businesses. They have interests all over the world. It would be extraordinarily. It would be an extraordinarily bad thing. I mean, I think this whole issue of his business and all of those entanglements, the thousands of suits that he faces, and I think these are uncharted waters. I was interested. His attorney in this Trump University case in Arizona went in and asked for a continuance. The trial's supposed to start, I think, in a week or two, and he said, he's very busy with this transition. Can we wait until after he takes office? And I'm thinking, if he thought he was busy during the transition, what does he think the presidency is going to be like? So, but anyway, I think they play a big role. I don't think there are too many people in the inner circle, and he doesn't trust many people, and he trusts his children. But how they separate their role in commerce from this advisory role is going to be one of the many questions that have to be answered.
Another question has to do with just President Obama. So we have Donald Trump coming into the White House and the Obama administration exiting it. The question reads, what is Obama now likely to do next in life? He has a lot of productive years ahead.
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons that he ran at the time that he did wasn't just that it was the right time and that he thought he could make a contribution there, but also that it was appealing to have life ahead of him after he got out of the White House. And I think he's going to be very productive. His foundation, which will be headquartered here, is going to become a spawning ground for change around the country and the world. From the bottom up, I think he's going to try and lift up people who are engaged in activities to improve their communities and their countries. I think he'll be involved in our own city and some of the struggles that we have. I think he's going to be impactful. The pressure he's going to face now is because the Democrat Party doesn't have obvious leaders to step up in this Trump era. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him to speak on this. And I know that he felt that he once told me that he learned a lot about being a former president from the two Bushes who were very respectful to him and stayed out of, when they had the opportunity to comment on some of the things that he'd done, they didn't. And so I think this is going to become a complicated question for him, because if he sees things that are obvious outrages, how does he what is his appropriate role?
Yeah.
Right now, I think I'm very proud of the way he's handled himself in this interim period, because there is a responsibility of the president to try and help the next president make a successful entry into the presidency. I know among some ardent Democrats there is this sense of, why is he helping? Well, he's helping because that's our process, that's democracy. Yeah. The other guy, he won, he's going to be the next president, and there's an obligation on the part of the sitting president to help the new president make a good entry into that office.
What about the obligations for the rest of us? You and I have had a lot of conversations with students in the last week or so. Many of them were strong Hillary Clinton supporters, and others who were supporters of Bernie Sanders or whatever, who are struggling with this a lot. We have others who are excited about the opportunities that now are available in Washington. We also know that participation in terms of the total percentage of the electorate of eligible voters turning out was just barely over 50%, like 53%, something like that.
Yeah.
So we have some questions about this, about whether this is an awakening for broader participation, what your message is.
Well, my message is this, I wrote a book called Believer. I'm as much a believer today as I was when I wrote it. We are blessed to have a democracy. And, I am the son of an immigrant who came from a place where there was not, and where there was religious persecution. And we have something that's really important. Sometimes we take it for granted. How often have we heard, well, it really doesn't matter who wins? It really does. And now I think we're in for a big example of why it matters who's in. I mean, whatever your belief is, and I know there are Republicans here and Democrats, Donald Trump is going to lead the country in a much different place, in a much different way than Hillary Clinton would have. And some of those decisions will have profound implications for generations to come. Just as in 2000, the election of George W. Bush by the margin of 537 votes in Florida was a very significant event in American history because of the things that followed. So my message is, don't turn away, turn in. Treat that franchise with more respect. Understand that elections do have big implications, and that's how we grab the wheel of history and steer. If you don't like the direction we're going, then get in there and grab the wheel and try and steer and make a correction and steer in a different way.
We just have a few minutes left. One of the questions that's a nice follow-up is we have a lot of young people in our office fired up and wanting to do something. So you made the deep case around why to get involved, but where should they channel that?
Well, I think that there are lots of ways to do it. First of all, I think that there are going to be issues that arise as a result of some of the policies of the new administration related to immigration, related to healthcare, related to the environment, and so on. And there are going to be organizations that are existing and will come to exist to deal with some of those challenges. And putting some effort into those are important. I think finding leaders or potential leaders who you believe in and working with them in campaigns, working with them on policy is really important. This is the president always says democracy is a participatory sport. This is no time to be on the sidelines, so find candidates and causes that you care about and enlist in them. And I think we need these young people. I'm inspired by them, as you are, every single day, because they're very worldly. I mean, they care deeply about the world. They understand they have responsibilities, but they're skeptical about politics, and this may make them more skeptical about politics. But we have to continually remind them that this is the way we forge the future, and they're going to be, as you know, their answer is, well, we can start an app, we can engage in social media. These are important, powerful tools. In fact, government can learn from them, but they're no substitute for the decisions that Congress is going to make, or state legislatures, or city councils. And those decisions are going to affect dramatically all the equities that these young people care about, whatever side of the debate they're on. So, you know, we need them. Yeah. We need them.
One final question for you. As we reflect not just on the election itself, but on the campaign, we talked about some of the forces that divide us. I think a lot of us are trying to figure out how you actually bridge that gap in conversation. How do we actually create a more cohesive sense of shared values that bring us together across parties, across geographies, across class and race and other identities?
Well,
how do we do that?
Well, first of all, let's stop being disdainful of people who voted for Donald Trump. You know, there are some people, obviously, you know, when you're talking about the supremacists and the David Dukes of the world and so on. But, you know, that's one thing. But I have a home, I bet you a bunch of other people do here in Southwest Michigan. Mine happens not to be on the lake, but rather in a rural community. People all over my area had Trump signs in their front yards. And they were yards, not lawns, by the way. And they're good neighbors, they're good people, they're hardworking people. Many of them have been those, they worked in factories and around the area that have now closed. They're scraping along. They feel like they've been forgotten. When Donald Trump says the system is rigged, they feel that. So let's not disdain that experience. Let's understand it and understand that that's not the future we want for the country. I mean, I know there are captains of business and industry here, and my urgent plea to you is think hard about how we adapt this economy in such a way that we don't have a small group of winners and a large group of people who are just hanging on or falling behind. That is not a prescription for coherence either in our politics or our society. So we have to make an effort to understand each other. Now, I would say to my neighbors in Michigan, you have to make an effort to understand how that young, undocumented worker who's a splendid person in every way, who's a student or serving in the military, feels, or how
working on the field just not far away from where you are in Southwest
exactly.
Michigan.
Yeah. Or Muslims who are as devout as they may be and share values. And you know, we need to have the conversation both ways. But since there not many of my neighbors from Southwest Michigan are here at the Standard Club, I choose to emphasize the other part because in certain ways the burden does fall on the winners not to fail, not to leave people behind. Because at the end of the day, if we lose from our country that fundamental belief, and we are close to it, I think in these areas we have lost it for now. This notion that in America, if you work hard, you can get ahead, that your work will be rewarded, that your kids have a chance for a better future. If we lose that, we lose something that is essential to our self-image, essential to our values, and really the glue that holds us together. So my plea to you is to think about it and think about what things we need to do as a country to try and ameliorate the impacts of what is also a very promising thing, which is new technology, globalization, and so on. Don't be disdainful.
I want to thank all of you for your input. We had more than 100 questions. I tried to get to as many of them as I possibly could. We wish we could stay here and answer more of them.
I did not give long answers in order to avoid any of your questions. I want you to know that.
But I want to thank you for your great questions. David, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it, as always. It's great.